Well, thank you, Alexis, and thank you, Nick. Welcome, everyone, to the IOA Energy webinar series. And as Alexis noted, this is our first webinar of 2014. Just want to quickly, before I formally introduce Nick, also let everyone know we've got a few other programs I'd like you to be sure to mark your calendar. Another webinar, this next webinar will look at Venezuela and Venezuela's energy outlook at the Maduro administration's 1-year mark. That is February 12th. And I'd also want to make sure everyone knows about our Caribbean Natural Gas Forum, which is in Santo Domingo in the Dominican Republic on February 13th. And then finally, mark your calendars for March 13th for another webinar, and we're going to be talking on March 13th about Canada's oil sands and the outlook for 2014 in terms of the oil sands. Well, I too want to add my appreciation to Bates White, our first sponsor of the 2014 IOA Energy Webinar Series. And Nick, you and I have talked a lot the last couple months about the energy reform, and specifically how we need to pay more attention, we being followers of the reform and interested parties, and we need to pay more attention to what may happen and what the elements of the reform are in terms of the electric sector, because it's perhaps just as profound or transformational, and hence the name of our webinar today, Transforming Mexico's Power Sector. And we are indeed delighted to have Nick Puga, a principal, a partner at Bates White, as our featured presenter. Nick has over 25 years of experience as a senior energy advisor across a whole range of the power sector, generation and transmission companies, utilities, all over the United States. But I want to make sure to underscore that Nick began his career in Mexico, and so has been following Mexico for all of those 25 years, and has a keen eye to what's going on in the power sector. And as you'll see in his presentation, really lays out some interesting analysis and breaks down what we may be seeing in the coming next couple of years in Mexico. So without further ado, I'd like to invite Nick to begin his presentation. And again, thank you all for being with us online today. Nick, over to you.
Well, thank you, Jeremy. I'm glad to join this webinar series. I think this topic today is particularly near and dear to my heart. I started my career, God, I don't want to say how many years ago, many years ago, actually longer than 25 years ago, in working for the Comisión Federal de Electricidad, which is the state-owned vertically integrated utility in Mexico. I worked for the Electrical Research Institute, and then I came to the United States for graduate school, and even though I have stayed ever since in the US and lived in various places around the world, I have continued to be deeply involved in policy and regulation and on project development in Mexico. And so that these changes that are brought about by the proposed restructure of the electric sector are a source of interest and concern for many of my clients, and I have tried to address some of them. Basically today what I would like to do is I would like to focus on taking a look at the objectives of the proposed restructuring, discuss whether these objectives will be easily achieved and what are the challenges that they will face, and try to get a grasp and understanding on whether the timeline that is being proposed is realistic and how long it would take for the effects of the restructuring to be felt by the various players in the power sector. So, and you will apologize for me going over things that many of the participants in this seminar will know by heart, but I think it is important to set the background. The current structure of the Mexican electric sector, as I said, has one single utility, Comisión Federal de Electricidad, which is a federal agency of the government in Mexico, which serves 23 million accounts throughout the country and covers the whole geography of the nation. They are vertically integrated, and they own and have contracts with generators to serve what is referred to as a public sector load. There was some early modifications to the monopoly of the status of CFE in 1992, in which the government allowed limited participation by the private sector in generation. Outside of that, all of generation, transmission, and distribution, as the law stands today, is reserved for the state, so that the only generation that is not owned or run by CFE is owned by Pemex to serve its own load and refineries, and by that a small participation of the private sector in the form of IPPs under contract to CFE as the monopsonist, single buyer to serve public load, self-suppliers, which is a form of contract that is allowed for public sector participation, in which a number of end users can associate to form a generation company and then wheel over the CFE transmission and distribution system to serve their load. That's called self-supply. And also, the 1992 changes to the law allowed for co-generators to generate for their own load inside the fence. So what does this proposed reform do to the structure of the sector? And so it is quite of a radical change in the structure. It foresees that generation will now be fully competitive. There will be a market for generation in which all generating plants, either owned or controlled under contract by CFE or owned by the private sector, and I mean all of generation, including renewable facilities, cogeneration facilities, self-supply facilities, will all participate in a energy market, and which will be operated, administered, and operated by an independent entity called the Centro Nacional de Control de Energía, which would be government-owned, but it would be totally independent from CFE. Now, the current reform, contrary to the prior attempt at reform in the sector in the late 1999 to 2003, when finally proved politically unfeasible, it preserves CFE in terms of transmission and distribution, and while it continues the monopoly control of transmission and distribution in terms of ownership of the assets, CFE would now be allowed to have some form of private sector participation in distribution and transmission. Now, there would be a number of users using above a certain amount of energy, 2,400 megawatt hours, although a year, although that's not quite defined, I don't believe, in the current structural reform at the constitutional level. That would be contestable. In other words, these customers will be open to competition from anybody, and smaller customers will still be served by CFE. For those areas where there are a small number of independent grids that are not interconnected to the mainland, for a while, including Baja California Sur and several other small grids in Baja California Sur and other parts of the country, the largest users on those grids would also be contestable. And that's what in this graph I refer to as qualified users. So, so what are the objectives of the reform? clearly the reform has been sold on the basis of reduction of electricity prices. That has been the selling point of the reform. It's by some accounts, electricity prices in Mexico are very high among other OECD countries. But the other objectives of the restructuring would be to strengthen CFE, not to privatize it and do away with it, as some people may think, to introduce full competition to generation in an attempt to create basically a reduction in wholesale prices by competition, to open the power sector to further private investment, since the 1982 changes have not produced as much investment as the government expected. And at the same time, providing the policymaker and the regulator in the sector the proper legal toolkits. In the past, they have been legal structure deficiencies that have prevented CRE from really asserting its authority as a regulator over CFE. Promote investment in renewable electricity, and to reduce technical and non-technical transmission and distribution losses. So I would like to see how whether these objectives would be easily achieved or not. So if we all these objectives are interrelated, as you will see. The lowering electricity prices. If one looks at the tariffs for electricity in Mexico, we can observe that as of 2013 and the first half of 2013, the residential tariffs were actually, the vast majority of them, below almost by 24% of the US average. However, those tariffs were heavily subsidized. They only collected about 30 to 42% of the cost. And only that residential tariff for the very high energy users is 49% above cost. So there are significant subsidies being poured into the residential sector. Now, the small commercial medium voltage tariffs, which serves many of the job creators, if you want to refer to them as that in Mexico, are slightly above cost, to 15%, 14% above cost. And the high voltage, and those are the customers that the government is trying to ease the pressure of electricity costs. And the high voltage customers, which are essentially at a par with cost. So the question really is, are the residential users going to be seeing their tariffs go up or down? And politically, it would be highly unpalatable to see those tariffs rise. So I'm not sure whether the government will be able to eliminate the subsidy to the residential class without a lot of political backlash. Now, the real potential for lowering electricity prices is rather obvious. The distribution losses are very high in Mexico, much higher than international standards. In 2013, they went up to 15.3%. That is losses in distribution lines and transformers and so forth, electrical losses. And basically, theft represented almost 6% of the energy that CFE doesn't collect revenues for. Now, the catch there is that technical loss reduction will require a significant new investment in the distribution grid. And obviously, even though the new reform contemplates allowing the private sector to come in with its technical expertise and capital resources, they will require a return on their investment. And clearly, while on the one hand lowering the losses and increasing revenues for CFE, they will also have to account for the returns to the investors that would help them bring them down. And you can see that the lowering prices and loss reduction are interrelated, because there are two objectives of this reform, as we saw. Now, how can CFE be strengthened. For many years, I've heard a lot of charges against CFE, saying that it's inefficiently run, that it's overstaffed. CFE has done a very good job in electrifying the country, which is one of its key missions, and really being the instrument of economic development policy of the Mexican government. And so it's somewhat unfair to accuse CFE of having done a terrible job. They have been significantly limited in the amount of money they can invest because they're an agency of the federal government and subject to the budget pressures that all agencies of the government are subject to. So what are the changes that they're proposing to make? The sketchy reform as it stands today, because the secondary legislation has not been passed, talks about changing CFE to Empresa Pública Productiva. Now, this term, it doesn't really exist in Mexican legislation. There is no form of corporation that is called an Empresa Pública Productiva, so that would have to be defined as part of these new laws that will be passed. Another way to strengthen CFE would be to free CFE to compete for the largest customers that have been leaving the system under the self-supply formula. The language of the reform and other accompanying documents by the Secretaría de Energía talk about allowing CFE to really compete for those customers which now leave because they can always get a discount, a significant discount of the existing retail tariff. Now, the reform also calls for allowing CFE to operate under a special regime of the Ley de Adquisiciones, Arrendamientos y Servicios y Obras Públicas, which is not unlike the U.S. acquisition regulations for the federal government, and it forced CFE to make very bad choices in purchasing equipment and services. And so hopefully that will help CFE also compete. And finally, allow CFE to rely on the private sector and bring him to help on the form of build, operate, and transfer type contracts in the transmission and distribution arena. And that would include smart grid improvements and reconductoring of certain transmission facilities, smart grid improvements to the bulk transmission system, etc. Now, going back to this Empresa Pública Productiva, which doesn't exist, nobody knows what it means, and I guess the questions that I ask myself is, will it be a true corporatization? The reform talks about an enterprise that will be operated as under the accepted state-of-the-art principles of enterprise management, and will be have an objective of economic value creation. Well, I have questions as to how that will be measured. Will it be measured as profit to the state, making money for the state? Would it be through economic development and economic value creation to the state through the country by increasing GDP and increased tax collection, etc.? And then the biggest questions that I have is when CFE is made to stand alone and be a profitable, by whatever measure that is, corporation, what happens to the current subsidies to promote renewable generation? CFE offers right now some of the most attractive incentives in the world, include to renewable generation for self-supply, including subsidized transmission rates, which are all-inclusive postage stamp rates, depending on how many voltage levels you have to traverse to serve your load, and are all-inclusive in terms of ancillary services, so you don't have to pay for backup and regulation and other services. It also recognizes a capacity contribution at the peak system hour each month, which then the generator can allocate to its load to reduce the billing demand charges from CFE. And finally, one of the best known features of this incentives is the energy banking, which allows the leveling of the intermittent generation of renewable resources so that the generator, the self-supplier, can deliver energy when the load needs it, right? So these are significant subsidies that the government is going to have to address, whether they'll be paid out of revenues that CFE will collect, which is not going to leave much room for investment, or whether Mexico and the Treasury will clearly channel subsidies in order to achieve the renewable energy policy goals. Now, these actions of strengthening CFE will also advance some of the two other objectives, which are opening the sector to further investment, obviously, and reducing the technical and non-technical losses by basically making CFE more focused on reducing losses and increasing revenues. So what happens to the other, one of the other objectives? This is the introduction of full competition in generation. There's not much detail in both in the documents produced by the Secretaría de Energía as the blueprint for restructuring of the oil and gas sector and electrical sector, or in the very broadly sketched constitutional reform passed by the Congress. I think all the detail for how these markets will work will be in the enabling legislation, secondary legislation, and implementing rules or regulations, the reglamentos of all these laws. But based on the past design in the early 2000s that the government had found amenable and had been accepted by the various stakeholders before it proved politically infeasible, we can think that this is going to be an electric market for energy in which there's going to be an additional payment for capacity made to generators based on the some measure of outage cost to the various customer classes, plus the loss of load probability in the system. From what we know, bilateral contracts will be allowed to exist, but considering the fact that all the renewable self-supply contracts today and the efficient cogeneration contracts today have these incentives built into the interconnection contract and the terms of the PPAs to the self-supplied members of these companies. They may have to be novated, meaning they will have to be made to basically naming the Centro Nacional de Control de Carga, or maybe they'll be left alone and allow CFE to continue supplying those benefits to those contracts, those subsidies, or they may have to be renegotiated. The fact that the government has spoken of allowing CFE to compete for those clients and that all the energy generation will go through the market, and we'll talk a little bit more about the structure of the market. All the generators will offer to sell through the market in a day-ahead market, and then the market will be settled for differences between the committed and dispatched volumes of electricity. And so that when the generators don't get dispatched, they would have to buy energy to supply their load through the market. So that's what I'm saying is some of the conditions of all these contracts may have to be adjusted or changed. The other aspects of this introduction of full competition in generation is that, in my view, it will require the establishment of multiple generation companies out of the CFE generation portfolio. Otherwise, CFE, who operates about 64% of the generation capacity, and has many plants and load pockets without transmission access to other generators could exercise market power. Now, renewable generation would be favored by this market design because in security-constrained economic dispatch, those resources would be dispatched first. Although, as I said, they may end up losing some of the subsidies, they will get paid the market clearing price, which would be the last, the marginal plant, which would be have a marginal variable cost of generation much higher than a renewable energy plant would have. So there's going to be a lot of headroom there for perhaps compensating for the loss of subsidies. Now, this introduction to full competition, and this is an aspect that I have discussed with Jeremy in a prior conversation and webinar, is that it will require very significant investment in expanding the capacity of the grid. This national grid in Mexico has been developed over many years by CFE to compensate for the lack of availability of cheap fuels in certain areas. So many times we refer to the grid in Mexico as gas by wire. And also to take the maximum advantage of the fact that CFE can say where the plants would go, and they would be hopefully placed somewhere near the load or somewhere near the parts of the transmission system with the most available capacity for wheeling to other areas. But if you want to have truly have competition, you would have to build a much more robust system that there is today. So, this full competition in generation would clearly open the sector to further private investment and also promote investment in renewable electricity, as I mentioned. Now, the objective of furthering private investment in the sector will be helped by the fact that all these generation plants that CFE has kept in reserve or operating because of lack of availability of natural gas and considerations of the labor force and issues with the unions, hopefully will be finally retired. And so that all generation plant retirement would open opportunities for new capacity, and as long as the compensation for capacity is adequate in the design of the market, new investors will build new generation to replace it with state-of-the-art gas-fired generation and other technologies. It would also, as I said, promote investment in renewable electricity and help reduce technical and non-technical losses through this type of contracts when the grid has to be expanded to enable competition. And CFE invites private sector companies to build that additional capacity in transmission. I think that this objective of furthering private investment runs counter to the idea that we're going to have to perhaps renegotiate a lot of the existing contracts and therefore creating some level of uncertainty while the details of the restructuring are clarified. So clarity in secondary legislation and the implementing rules and regulations will be essential to bring further investment to the market in Mexico. And the current investors that may be exposed to losses may have to be compensated or they may not return. Now, one of the things that I wanted to cover is this timeline. This is an ambitious exercise in which the government of the new administration, the Peña Nieto administration, started working very early after taking power. In December of, as probably all the participants know, on December 11 of 2013, the Mexican Congress approved the constitutional reform, changing Article 27 to enable the participation or terminating the monopoly on generation and changing the terms of other reservations for the state for CFE. Now, by December 16th, 25 of the 31 states had endorsed the reform, and frankly, I didn't have time before the seminar to check whether they had all endorsed it, but it only required a majority of endorsement by the states to pass. So, having been passed in December 20th, President Peña Nieto, without further delay, signed the constitutional reform. So now we find ourselves in 2014, and from conversations with various parties in Mexico, it appears that the secondary laws are almost complete, which leads me to believe that the government was hard at work when this constitutional reform was proposed, and that the laws may indeed be ready. There is an ambitious calendar that calls for, by April of this year, to pass all the secondary legislation to regulate the exploration and development in geothermal power generation, and to modify or pass new laws that will regulate the public service in electrical service, the LSPE, which is the main law, la Ley de Servicio Público de Energía Eléctrica. The law of the federal regulator, the Comisión Reguladora de Energía, a law to create this new Centro Nacional de Control de la Energía and the Market Administrator, and other secondary laws that deal with environment and so forth. Also by April 14th, the Congress will draft and pass a law to regulate the operation of the state-owned electrical power company, which will no longer be CFE, but will be this Empresa Productiva del Estado, right? So that brings us to early 2015, where CENER is called to develop a strategy to transition to cleaner generation technology and fuels. We have to remember that back in 2013, Mexico passed a clean energy law that makes commitments to have 35% non-fuel energy generation by 2026, I believe. And so that in order to meet those very ambitious goals, even with all these changes to the power sector, CENER will have to have a clean strategy to promote non-fossil generation, whether that be renewables or nuclear, or a combination of both. By mid-2015, the new dispatch independent system operator and market administrator should be established, and they should be hard at work in specifying, buying, and testing all the hardware and software systems to operate the system, the integrated electrical system, and to operate the market. And by 2016, CFE will cease to operate as it has historically until now. So that we're talking optimistically by mid-2017 for the wholesale market operations to begin. Now, there is, in theory, sufficient time. Experience in the United States and other countries has proven that there are some potential issues that may delay the launching of the market, but it's doable. But definitely, probably half a decade or a full decade will be needed to really iron out all the wrinkles out of the system. So with that, Jeremy, I don't know how we'll manage. We seem to have a lot of questions that I've been seeing on the screen. So
thank you very much, Nick. This is, yeah. Thank you very much for your presentation. Sorry, I just cut you off. I was, did you have some final comments before we launch into the Q&A session?
Well, my final comments are that we're still waiting to see the secondary legislation. It obviously has to be discussed, and all parties in Congress have to agree on the conditions set forth in those laws and pass them by April of this year. So my expectation is that the laws would be unveiled soon. And the devil is in the details. We will see how this goes.
Wonderful, thank you.
And
That was
with
that was a fantastic introduction. We have a lot of questions, as you can see, and I would like to launch straight into them so we can get to as many as possible in the last of 20 minutes or so, if that's all right with you, Nick.
that'll be fine. I'm trying to navigate through the questions here. Let me see. How do I
Don't
go
worry,
up on the?
I'll moderate the questions, so you can just you can just focus on answering them. I'll do the work of digging through them. But just before we start, I want to remind people you can put your question in the chat function, but I would ask that you do it in the question box. It just happens if you do it in the chat and you make it very long, it won't fit on the screen. It'll be a bit more difficult to read. And the question tab has a sort of, I think, Twitter-like 140 character limit or so, which helps to keep things brief. But if you don't mind, Nick, I'm actually going to start off with a question I received by email earlier in the session. One of our participants asked if you could talk a little bit more about this wholesale market. Is it necessary? What's it going to look like? I know you ended on that, so maybe if we could use that as a launch pad for the questions. If you could talk a little bit more about what this wholesale market would look like, if it's, how likely it is to happen, etc.
Well, if the wholesale market design follows the design of the 2000 or the reform proposed in 2000, designed by the Secretary of Energia with the help of some U.S. consultants. At the time, you remember that they were being they had been observing the development of the markets in England and in Argentina and Chile, and they basically had designed a wholesale energy market with security constrained commitment and dispatch, in which the market clearing price would be a combination of the marginal offer to the market plus a capacity component that was calculated based on the outage cost to customers, which is a parameter that is calculated through a study in which the costs to the various type of customers are weighted by their participation in the market, and the loss of load probability 1 day in 10 years and so forth in the market. So that in addition to the most expensive most expensive unit variable cost, there would be a capacity payment to encourage new entrants into the market.
Thank you. Can I just, I'm going to go to the next question, but very quickly, I just wanted to remind people, I got a lot of questions here about the slideshow. We will be sending you a PDF copy of the slideshow, and we're actually also recording this discussion, so you can come back and listen to it again later, or if you had to go away and come back, you can catch up on that later. That should be up early next week. I'll have the slideshow to you later today. So moving on to the next question, we have a question here saying, does reform mean Mexico may import more power from the US?
Well, that's a good question. It depends on whether more new plants are built in Mexico, and the investment or the signals to the investors in Mexico are sufficient to attract investment to build new capacity. And it will also depend on whether the transmission capacity to bring that power to market and load is timely built. So if those conditions don't occur, there would be a limited amount of power imported from the U.S. perhaps to substitute some of the power from the northern part of the country power plants, which are of recent vintage, and that would probably be wheeled into the center of the country for to serve load in the country, so that um, and it also will depend on transmission. So um, nothing has been discussed in terms of changing the current regulations for importation of power from the United States. And they're somewhat cumbersome. So that's as much as I can tell.
So there's a lot of variables. The next question we have is about PPAs. Whether you think the existing PPAs will be renegotiated, what is the anticipated return on investment?
Well, I will tell you that when I was preparing the presentation and reading and rereading all the drips and drabs of information that the government has released, there's nothing clear about whether the PPAs, the private PPAs, will be renegotiated. If you read, there was an interview with the Undersecretary of Electricity in the December issue of Energía Hoy, which is a recent addition in terms of magazines in Mexico. It's a good magazine. And in that interview, I think the Undersecretary was sort of hinted at the fact that that never said it in so many words, but that's what I read between the lines, that they may have to be renegotiated. But that's my reading of the article. I don't want to put words in the Undersecretary's mouth.
All right. Well, yeah. Perhaps we could move over to the question side here. We have, could you comment on the proposed referendum on the reforms? What it would have on? Well, that's a very, very big question.
I'm not sure what, well, yeah, okay. Well, I don't know about the proposed referendum, but clearly, in order to pass all the laws that really contain all the detail of the reform, although frankly, the biggest obstacle to the reform last time around was the visceral reaction of many Mexicans to overturning or changing Article 27, and so in the Constitution. Now that that has been overcome, I, short of having a popular reaction that would be very negative to the reform, I don't see the members of Congress in Mexico not passing this legislation in time to implement the reform. Now, there is a lot of compromises on the way to the forum, so who knows what the final legislation is going to end up looking like. Remember California? You know, it was a political negotiation, and see where it took us, right? So I would say that since the reform is being sold on the premise of lowering power rates, electricity tariffs, I would say that the commercial and industrial lobbies are all for it. And I don't think the government has been, they have talked about the fact that a lot of the residential tariffs are lower than they're subsidized, but nobody has said explicitly that the residential tariffs may rise. And so if they're really going to operate CFE as a business, then the electricity tariffs may have to rise. So that may impact the willingness of the members of Congress to pass reforms that would point in that direction.
Well, the next question, I apologize, is a bit long. It's a bit difficult to read, so I'm just going to read it out for those who the writing's a bit small. It's basically asking how any sort of privatization will work if transmission and distribution segments are not open to the private sector. But do you see opening only to only the generation part to private companies, and at the end of the day, privates will be only selling energy to the state and maybe some deregulated users, while CFE will remain in the whole chain? So that's a little bit of a long question there, but how do you see the privatization, possible privatization
I
between
think that
transmission?
there might be some confusion, and I would say not hard to believe because it's not a very clear scheme at this point. But um, I I'm not sure that the straight franchising of the transmission and distribution business would bring about tremendous efficiencies beyond what CFE would achieve by throwing up its labor force, one. Number two, by bringing technology and basically refurbishing the distribution systems, so that the private sector will be allowed to participate in the reconstruction of the transmission and distribution grids and will be properly compensated, otherwise it won't participate. So I wouldn't see it as really not opening the transmission and distribution business to the private sector only because the distribution business will not be franchised or the transmission business will not be franchised. I think that is going to be limited participation, but I think probably in some of the most profitable areas. I think that one of the concerns of the Mexican state is that if they were to franchise the distribution, the easiest thing to do in distribution to save money and increase profits is to fire people and cut labor, which Mexico has been trying to increase, right? So it's an employment policy that wouldn't be very successful. Now, as far as the participation in the market, I don't think it's necessarily true that all the energy will continue to be sold to CFE. In reality, all the energy will be sold to the market, and the market will fulfill the commitments of all the contracts out there, including also CFE, with whoever gets dispatched first, right? So if a generator has an efficient plant with low production costs, that plant will be profitable. And the load will be served from the energy produced by that plant. I don't know if that somewhat answers that long question from Gabriela.
Well, here's another sort of long question, but it goes back to what you were talking about before. So the experience in other Latin American countries with the quality of service improving, but prices also increasing. And how do you think Mexico will follow with that?
Well, you know, I kind of like the siren song of lower electricity prices, but the problem is that when you have a system that has seen decades of underinvestment by the budgetary vagaries of the Mexican government, and it's going to require massive investment, I have a hard time believing that it would lead to immediate reductions in electricity prices. So I think in the long run, we would reach lower electricity prices compared to what otherwise would have been. But in the short run, short of maintaining the subsidies, I think it's going to be hard to achieve all these conflicting goals of upgrading the system and providing good returns to investors to relieve the burden of investment from the Mexican government. And all at the same time while reducing the electricity prices to the consuming public.
Well, another question back to CFE and another elaborating on what you said before. Could you just talk a little bit more about how the ley de adquisiciones for CFE to make poor choices?
Well, I mean, I'll give you an example. I mean, there's very clear rules of, for example, the ley de adquisiciones when CFE was tendering to supply their needs for electricity would not allow the construction of a plant on the U.S. side of the border or the bidding by a U.S. side of the border plant, because under this law, CFE would have to be able to um, uh, take possession of the plant if default occurred by the generator. So that obviously diminishes the choices along the border with the U.S. Number one. Number two, you have to have a competition, and if only one bidder shows up, in many cases the tender has to be canceled. And you know, there's the regulations on, for example, CFE would have to tender every acquisition, even though they know that the best supplier of a given piece of equipment or technology or service would be company A, but they would be forced to tender this RFP for open to many companies, and then they would have to buy the lowest cost or justify why they wouldn't buy the lowest price bid, and basically they would be questioned by the authorities as to why they would be willing to pay more if they had a lower price bid. So that is why CFE was forced to make poor choices many times in the past.
I think we have about 2 questions, and so I think that will take us to 12 o'clock on the dot. So let me just, oh, we have 3 questions. We'll see if we can fit the last one in, but we have a question here from Rick. Who retains responsibility for reliability, or will the new ISO take that role?
The new ISO will take that role. Absolutely.
That's good. We can fit another question in with an answer like that. So we have a question here from Bradley. Says, sorry, question disappeared while typing. What kinds of returns in generation could be seen with and without CFE competing?
Call me and hire me. I'll try to figure it out for you. I don't know. It's not something that I can answer off the top of my head. It really, the returns will depend on what the risk is, clearly, and there are a lot of pieces to that machine. So who knows?
All right. Well, look, here's the final question, a little bit more reflective. You know, what are the next steps? So what relevant items beyond laws that you laid out are likely to be included or addressed by the secondary legislation? So what's going to happen next?
What relevant items beyond laws? Well, okay, the laws that the secondary legislation basically the legal framework in Mexico flows from the Constitution, kind of like in the United States, and so there are laws that basically are based on constitutional principles, and then try to set up the rules for a given line of business or a given sector, a given economic activity. And at the same time, those they're called leyes reglamentarias, which means that they imply that they should be implementing rules or regulations that spell all the detail on how those laws will be implemented. And so it includes everything from who is an acceptable participant in a certain economic activity line to what are the times for certain activities, what will be the contractual requirements, how parties can demonstrate their capabilities. I mean, there are myriad things that have to be defined to set all the rules necessary to basically rule the conduct of all the participants in the market, both on the supply and in the demand side.
Wonderful. Thank you again, Nick. That was, thank you for the presentation and the wonderful answers. Thank you everybody else for the questions. We had no shortage of really interesting questions, and that's taken us right to 12 o'clock here in San Diego. So I just want to thank everybody again for joining us and pass you over to Jeremy for a few final words. And hopefully we'll see you at our next webinar on Venezuela in February 12th. Thank you very much. Have a wonderful afternoon.
Well, thanks, Alexis, and a hearty thank you to Nick Puga for his extremely insightful presentation today. I mean, obviously, there's a lot that we're going to have to wait and see in terms of the implementation legislation over the next 2 or 3 months. But given the information available today, Nick, I think you, in 30 minutes, laid it out and made us all the more informed as to what's happening in the Mexican power sector. And I really, really liked the timeline. That was fantastic to understand what's happening in some of the highlights of to what pretends in terms of prices was extremely interesting. So again, thank you. Thanks to Bates White, and thank you to everyone online here today with us. The IOA Energy Webinar Series is officially underway for 2014. So again, thanks everybody, and we'll see you online, or better yet, in person at one of our programs across the hemisphere. Have a great day.
Thank you, Jeremy.